Welcome back to another episode of Mr. Fincham's Fireside Follow-Alongs. Today we are going to start on page 20 of Explorers, Triumphs, and Troubles. Just before we get started here, we are going to take a look at the questions we'll be answering today at the end of our reading. The first one is, what challenges did the British explorers face on their voyage to Australia? So in this book, the British explorers are going to go to Australia. What challenges did they face? And the text-to-self connection question is, what you choose as transportation is important depending on your environment. If you could choose between a motorized sled or a dog sled to travel to the top of Mount Rainier, which would you choose and why? So as we will see in our readings, the transportation that you use, depending on where you're at, is going to be important. So you're going to want to bring different things if you're traveling in the desert than you would if you're traveling in Antarctica. So just keep those things in mind as we read. And first, we are going to start with
Antarctica.
Antarctica on page 20. The race to the pole. In 1911, no explorer had ever reached the South Pole. That year, the British explorer Robert Scott announced his plan to go there at the same time as Norway's Roald Amundsen. It quickly became a race. Preparing for the pole. Scott prepared carefully for the journey. His team would use ponies and motorized sleds to carry supplies to dumps along the route, and the explorers would travel between these, collecting supplies as they went. After the last supply dump, they would man-haul, which meant dragging their food and equipment, along in sleds. Scott's team set out for the South Pole from Cape Evans on November 1st, 1911. So here's the route they took. All the way from Cape Evans, all the way down to the South Pole. And we're going to go to page 21. Let's take a look at the journey fact file here first. The date, 1911 and 1912. Men in original party, 12. The route distance, 1,766 miles, almost 3,000 kilometers long. Time spent on ice, 5 months. Dangers, snowstorms, high winds, ice, sub-zero temperatures. So, before we read the triumph and trouble sections, let's take a look at this. Disastrous end. Scott's expedition was a disaster. The motorized sleds broke down, the ponies could not cope with the cold and ice, and man-hauling supplies was exhausting. Scott and 4 others reached the pole 5 weeks after their Norwegian rivals, but they soon were too weak to get home safely, and all 5 of the explorers died. Triumph. Scott and his men made a heroic effort in terrible conditions. Even though their equipment did not work, they still managed to reach the pole. In fact, some of them almost made it back. So the triumph here was they reached the South Pole. No one had done that before, and they reached it. Or trouble. Scott made a mistake. People already knew how to travel safely through icy wastes using dog sleds, skis, and thick furs, which had been keeping explorers safe in the Arctic for many years. Amundsen used these and succeeded, and Scott failed because he did not. So let's go to page 22.
Australia.
Australia.
The First Fleet.
The First Fleet. On January 26th, On January 26th, 1788, a group of Eora people from Australia woke up to see 11 ships in the bay where they lived. This was unusual, as ships rarely passed through the bay. So the Eora people, they wake up, they look outside at the water, and they see ships. They don't see that very often. A welcome landfall. The people aboard the ships, which we now call the First Fleet, must have been very pleased to arrive. Their journey from Britain to Australia had taken 250 days, and they had endured storms, shortages of food and water, and even a mutiny. A mutiny is when the crew of a ship decides to take it over from the captain. So maybe they don't agree with what the captain is doing, they don't agree with his route, they don't like him. Whatever the case may be, that is when the crew rises up and takes control of a ship. What do you think? Were the British right to claim Australia? When the British arrived in Australia, they decided that the land was legally terra nullius, Latin for no one's land. They thought this allowed them to claim the territory for Britain. Do you think this was right? I want to know what you guys think. Let me know what you think about that. We're going to go on to page 23. Take a look at the journey fact file here first. The date, 1787 to 1788. Ships in fleet, there was 11. Passengers and crew, about 1,480, so just shy of 1,500 people. Time spent at sea, 8 months at sea. Dangers, there were storms, shipwreck, fire aboard ships, sickness, thirst, and hunger. So, the British settlement. The new arrivals quickly began to put up tents and then build roads, fences, and houses. Their settlement would have looked strange to the Eora, who lived, dressed, and used the land differently than Europeans. The Europeans thought they could come into Eora country and settle there, but the land belonged to the Eora, claiming Australia. The British knew before they arrived that people already lived in Australia. Because another famous British explorer, Captain James Cook, had reached the coastline of eastern Australia in 1770 and made contact with the people who lived there. We now call these people Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, the British also knew there was no government, army, or police force, so they decided to claim the land as their own. So the British came, touched base in Cape Town, South Africa, and came all the way to Australia. And they landed there and they said, hey, there's no army, there's no police force. We're going to claim this land as our own. Australia. Conflict arises. At first, the British and the Eora people did not fight, but soon they were in conflict. The Eora people had lived on the land for centuries and respected the land, taking only what they needed and managing it well. The British fenced off large areas of the Eora people's land, which prevented them from crossing it. By 1790, many Eora were frustrated by the new arrivals. A local leader named Pumulwuy began a series of attacks against the British and became a great hero to many Eora. The conflict lasted until Pumulwuy was killed in 1802. So let's take a look at this little wanted poster that they put up. Wanted, Pumulwuy, charged with the murder of John McIntyre, the governor's huntsman, and many other white men. Charged with raiding and setting fire to the government farm of Toongabbie, leading 100 warriors into Parramatta Town, and other heinous crimes, too many to list. So, if you're Pumulwuy, right, you're Pumulwuy, you live in this place in Australia, people show up and they start claiming the land as their own. Are you just going to let that happen? I don't know. And then, on the other hand, if you're the British, you show up and you start trying to set up farms and houses so you and your people can live, and they start attacking you, right? So what's your response to that going to be? That's the conflict. Now we're going to go to page 25 here. Triumph. The arrival of the first fleet was the start of European settlement in Australia. Since then, Australia has become a wealthy, modern nation. Its people are from European, Asian, and other backgrounds, and they all share in the country's success. Or trouble. The arrival of the British was devastating for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. 2 years after the British arrived, up to 70% of the Eora had died from smallpox. In the next 100 years, the total number of Indigenous Australians dropped from roughly 1 million to 60,000. So, in 100 years, 946,000 perished. Or 940,000, excuse me. Today, Indigenous Australians make up about 3% of the population. For the most part, they have not shared in Australia's modern wealth, and they are among the country's poorest people. 70% of them died from smallpox. The reason is because their bodies had never seen smallpox before, so they weren't able to develop antibodies. When you get sick and then you get better, and your body is able to fight off a disease, it's harder for that disease to come back because now your body knows what's needed to defeat it. if you have never seen a virus before, if it's a new virus, it's way harder to fight against, right? So we're going to go on to page 26. Australia. Burke and Wills. On August 20th, 1860, crowds cheered as the Victorian exploring expedition left Royal Park in Melbourne, Australia. The explorers were aiming to make the first ever crossing of Australia from south to north. Robert Burke and his second in command, William Wills, led the expedition. So they want to be the first ones ever to start at Melbourne and go all the way up north. Right? They want to be the first ever to cross the continent going from south to north. Burke and Wills. Was Burke the right leader? What do you think? Burke had been an officer in the Australian Army and the police, so he was a trained leader. He had no experience as an explorer, though, and Burke was famous for getting lost, even in his hometown. So I want to know what you guys think about this. On one hand, Burke and Wills, they were the first ever to make it across, right? That was their triumph. First ever to make it across. But at the same time, he wasn't a trained explorer. He didn't have any experience exploring, and he was famous for getting lost. If you're an explorer, you should be famous, in my opinion, for other things apart from getting lost, right? That seems a little crazy, but at the same time, look what they did. So what do you think? Was Burke the right leader? You tell me. I want to know what your guys' opinion is. And we are going to go to page 27. Let's take a quick look at the journey fact file here. The date, 1860 to 1861. The distance, roughly 2,020 miles or 3,250 kilometers from coast to coast. The dangers, heat, cold, thirst, hunger, venomous animals. You might be thinking, well, Mr. Fincham, how is the danger heat and cold? You would think that it would either be hot or cold, right? We're going to explore that more in a little bit. Numbers of explorers. There was 19. More than 600 people applied to take part. So more than 600 people said, hey, we want to go on this journey with you. And only 19 were taken. The weight of the supplies. At first, about 20 tons. 20 tons of supplies. So if 1 ton equals 2,000 pounds, how many pounds is 20 tons? Transport. Mainly camels. The expedition started with wagons, but these broke down on the first day. So you get your 20 tons of supplies ready. You pack it into wagons. Fast forward one day, your wagons are broken down. Not off to a great start, right? Terrible conditions. Conditions for the explorers were terrible. It was extremely hot in the day and freezing at night. Tiny black flies got in their noses, mouths, ears, and even their eyes. Rats nibbled the explorers' toes at night, and there were scorpions, venomous snakes, and mosquitoes. The expedition was also weighed down by more than 20 tons of equipment, including useless items, such as a Chinese gong and a heavy dining table. The explorers struggled to cover 18 miles per day. So let's think about this for a second. You have to go, let's just round this down to 2,000 miles. Let's say you have to go 2,000 miles, and you are struggling to cover, rounding up, 20 miles a day. So how many days would it take you to go 2,000 miles if you're going 20 miles a day? When you go camping and you're packing up your food and stuff, do you guys pack up your heavy dining room dinner table? I don't. That seems like a silly thing to bring camping with you, right? I wonder why they would bring these items. Maybe they just thought they would use them, or they didn't know it was going to be a struggle to carry. I don't know. But regardless, even without the useless items, the conditions were terrible, right? The flies, venomous snakes, mosquitoes, scorpions, rats nibbling at your toes as you try to sleep. No thanks. Cooper's Creek. After 3 months, the exhausted explorers reached Cooper's Creek, not even halfway to the north coast. This was the traditional territory of the Yonderwandi people. The explorers set up camp. They used as much of the creek's precious water as they liked, and they let their animals dirty the stream so that anyone further down could not use it. But the Yonderwandi did not complain. They could see the explorers were exhausted and needed to recover. The Yonderwandi even brought them gifts of fish and other food. Wow, I mean, what a generous people. So, picture in your mind a stream or a river. It's flowing one way, right? If you're standing next to it, you can look downstream and see that it's flowing away from you, right? If you're downstream from me and I'm letting my horses and my pigs or my camels and my ponies clean off in it, and you're downstream from me, they're going to the bathroom in it, and you're downstream, do you want to use that water to wash yourself, to drink, to wash your food, to cool off in? Probably not, right? And the Yonderwandi people did not really complain. They actually did the opposite. They helped them because they could tell that the explorers needed help, right? So, and we're going to go on to page 28. Australia. On to the north coast. After a month at Cooper's Creek, Burke set off for the north coast with William Wills, John King, and Charles Gray. The others were told to wait 3 months at Cooper's Creek for their return. By February 1861, the four men had gotten within 3 miles, or 5 kilometers, of the north coast. Mangrove swamps blocked their way, and they turned back. Gray, who was exhausted, died on the way home. And when the others finally stumbled into camp at Cooper's Creek, they found that the rest of the expedition had left that morning. So they almost made it right here, about 5 kilometers from the coast. But these mangrove swamps stopped them. If you guys remember Washed Up, the book Washed Up, one of the things that was hard to travel through was the mangrove swamps, right? All right, and we're going to go to the last page, page 29 here. Before we do the Triumph or Trouble section, let's start with this one here. The deaths of Burke and Wills. The 3 remaining explorers now survived partly on food that had been buried by the rest of the expedition before they left. They had left instructions on a tree about where the supplies were buried. This is now known as the Dig Tree. When the supplies ran low, the explorers were given food by the Yonderwandi. One day, Burke feared the Yonderwandi would steal expedition property, and he drove them off with a pistol shot. They did not return. Burke and Wills both died on June 30th, and the only survivor of the expedition was King, who was looked after by the Yonderwandi. So, Triumph? Burke, Wills, and King reached within 3 miles of the north coast. If they had returned to Cooper's Creek just a few hours earlier, the rest of the expedition still would have been there, and they would have made it back to Melbourne alive. So, they made it super close. 3 miles of the coast. To me, that is still a triumph. If it's 2,020 miles, they made it 2017. That's quite the expedition, right? Or trouble. Burke put his ambition to make history ahead of the safety of his men. He also treated the Yonderwandi with contempt. Contempt just means lack of respect. He used water from Cooper's Creek, camped on their territory, and took their food, then shot at them. Even then, the Yonderwandi looked after King until the search party arrived. So, the expedition, was it a triumph for everything that they achieved and everything that they learned and, the obstacles that they were able to get past, or was it more trouble? I want to know what you guys think. And before we sign off for the day, I'm just going to recap on the questions for you for this reading. The first one, what challenges did the British explorers face on their voyage to Australia? And the second one, what you choose as transportation is important depending on your environment. If you could choose between a motorized sled or a dog sled to travel to the top of Mount Rainier, which one would you choose and why? So, it is important to choose your transportation. If you're traveling through the snow, you're probably not going to want to bring horses or ponies because it's going to be hard for them to survive in such cold weather, right? But if you're traveling in the desert, you may not want to bring a pack of dogs because dogs have fur, and it's going to be hard for them to stay cool, right? It's so hot that you would want to bring camels. So if you had to travel to Mount Rainier, would you rather have a motorized sled and put all of your supplies on that, or would you rather have a dog sled and a team of dogs? Let me know what you guys think. As always, if you guys have questions or any comments or thoughts about the book, I would love to hear them. Feel free to email me or leave them in the comments section below or shoot me a message on Seesaw. Any of those things are great. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's section of our book, Explorers, Triumphs, and Troubles. Let me know what you think. I'll be interested to hear it. I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.